Hello there. I am Tim Noah, senior writer at Slate Magazine, and with me is,
Rich Lowry,
I'll let you introduce
editor
yourself.
of National Review. We almost hit it right, Tim, there, but not quite. But it's good to be with you this morning.
I'm pleased to be blogging heads with you again. We did this once before. I can't quite remember when.
It all runs together. I think we were arguing about healthcare, which we'll probably argue about again today, so nothing changes.
That's right. It's all nothing changes.
I think it was actually right after healthcare passed, and we were just getting into financial reform, and you were going through healthcare withdrawal, if I recall now.
I was, and in fact now I am. I'm in a fashion covering financial reform because I have moved on to a consumer beat, which includes the whole Elizabeth Warren complex.
I saw your post.
Anyway, I'm glad to be here with you today. We have many topics to discuss. I'd like to start actually by talking a little bit. I guess the big political news, is the Republicans have come up with a new contract for America, which is called the Pledge. What's it called? The Pledge of Allegiance or something.
Pledge to America.
The Pledge to America,
or the Plague on America, if you prefer, from James Clyburn.
I was one of those people who I have to really slow down when I say the contract for America, because of course I am always tempted to say the contract on America. And my first observation on the Pledge of Allegiance is that it does not contain any pledges for term limits. I think that little experiment that was tried 24 years ago has finally been declared a resounding failure. Do you feel misty-eyed over the end of term limits as a Republican Party cause?
I was never a term limits person, and we always hoisted up the flagpole Henry Hyde as our example of why you don't need term limits, and actually long-lasting statesmanship can be a good thing. I think that more of the problem is the gerrymandering and the lack of competitive elections. But in the scheme of things, when the American public is sick with the status quo and wants to change Congress, it manages to do it. We've learned from 1994 and 2006, and perhaps in November as well. So I don't see it. I see it a misbegotten solution to a non-problem.
And what happened in '96 was that part of the contract for America was a pledge for term limits. I forget exactly what the term limits were in the 1996 contract, but many of the people who were ushered in under it ended up changing their minds about its centrality to the Republican agenda as their time limits came up. And allowing Democrats to call them wild hypocrites, and I think it's fairly shrewd to have bypassed that particular reform this time. As a point of information, I just don't know. Are Tea Partiers talking about term limits? It would sound
you hear a little bit. You hear a little bit of it, but it's basically a 1990s era idea. Now you've had very effective term limits that I would support in the form of the Republican primaries, which have been hell on long-lasting incumbents who haven't really distinguished themselves in the United States Senate, which I think is a good thing. But obviously the emotional thrust of the Tea Party is on the fiscal issues, and that understandably, therefore, is the thrust of the pledge.
And the primaries also underscore your point that when the public is in a mood to throw the bums out, they don't need term limits; they just throw the bums out.
Yeah, the bums go. Yeah.
So now I'm inclined to agree. What do you think about term limits for committee chairmanships, which were put in place and which I've always had my qualms about as well?
I'm a little bit more favorable to that. Again, Henry Hyde is always our example of an exception, but you can actually, make exceptions for these people if they're extraordinary, but I'm a little wary of creating those internal fiefdoms. And it'll be a huge fight, as it was in the aftermath of 1984, if Republicans take the House this time, to control the Appropriations Committee, because you'll again have a freshman class coming in there all revved up to control spending, and you'll have an Appropriations Committee that's very entrenched and cares about nothing except spending. And that will be, the first couple of years, I think the Appropriations Committee will be back on its heels, but then the question is whether it will reassert itself and whether tried and true practices will prevail. One interesting idea I've heard on this is that Republicans should actually pack the Appropriations Committee, take kind of the FDR court packing scheme, and expand the Appropriations Committee and put as many freshmen and budget cutters on there as they possibly can to change what that committee is all about.
Now, something else that's missing from the pledge is, as Dana Milbank pointed out this morning in his column, is any discussion of earmarks, which seems an odd omission. There has been, the Tea Partiers have spoken out against earmarks, haven't they? And so has President Obama, for that matter. It would seem a somewhat bipartisan issue. Is that why it was left off of the pledge?
It's mystifying. The House Republicans took this, made a commitment not too long ago to have a moratorium on all earmarks. So it's bizarre and somewhat disturbing that it's not in there. I think that's the most...
Having a little trouble swearing off the bottle, perhaps?
Perhaps. We'll see. I mean, if they really think they can go back to doing that sort of stuff in this kind of environment, they're extraordinarily foolish. So that's one of the criticisms.
I mean, the Machiavellian argument would be, hey, if we're going to have the House, don't give away the levers of power. And earmarks are a key lever of power.
Yeah, that would just be extremely short-sighted. I mean, my colleague Ramesh Ponnuru pushes back from the rest of the right on earmarks and says, look, they're a tiny part of the fiscal problem, which is true, and why shouldn't others advance the argument, why shouldn't congressmen, well, this is what congressmen say themselves, why shouldn't we have some say about where this money is going to go, because it's going to be spent anyway, but it's just symbolically so poisonous. And I do think it played a role in the end of Republicans in 2006, and a huge role in most congressional scandals, certainly the Abramoff scandal, which was so damaging. So I think of the criticisms you hear from the right about the pledge, I think that's the most telling and sensible critique. There are a lot of conservatives also complaining there's not a balanced budget amendment in there, but since there's not the votes to pass the thing, I think that would just be empty symbolism.
Right, and Republicans in recent years, while in power, have not been great preachers of budget balancing anyway. I mean, they in the Bush era, that was not a major issue. Dick Cheney famously was reported to have said, that we learned in the 80s that deficits don't matter, which of course is not true. Deficits do matter, but Republicans are coming out of a long spell when they were downplaying the significance of deficits. They've been playing it up during the recession, because the recession has necessitated a lot of emergency spending. But the question is, will they remain fiscal conservatives if they come to power?
Well, that's a huge question, obviously. I'm with Dick Cheney that... Sorry. My fiance... I think this happened last time. I didn't turn off my phone, and she's calling.
Okay.
I think
Cheney. Take a message?
I think Cheney is right up to a point. When we had a $170 billion deficit in 06 or 07 or whatever it was, that's not a huge concern. But when you get deficits of the magnitude that we have now, and the prospect of them staying so large, over the duration, that obviously is a major concern. And that's another critique that's made of the pledge, both on the right and the left, is that it's not specific enough when it comes to spending. I think it's about
not specific at all, I believe, is the criticism I've heard, except for it calls for ending TARP spending, which I think is due to end in a couple of months anyway, so, big deal, and ending stimulus spending. And my understanding is it doesn't actually propose any other spending cuts, and it holds harmless Medicare and Social Security.
Well, I don't think that's quite right. It basically pledges, it doesn't use this explicit language because I think they're a little wary of the charge that they want to return to the Bush years, but they are committing to taking domestic discretionary back to 2008 levels. Now that's obviously only about 1/8 of the budget or something like that, so it's not the biggest thing in the world. But for
did you see this Paul Krugman column today where he said that if you leave the tax cuts in place and you hold entitlements harmless, then basically the only way you can achieve the goals laid out in the pledge is to shut down the entire government.
Well, I mean,
because again, as you say, discretionary spending is a relatively small part of the pie.
Yeah, but it's not nothing. I mean, it's extremely rare for Congress to take spending back 2 or 3 years, to the prior level. I think maybe it happened in the mid '90s, but otherwise the course has been an inexorable march upwards. So to at least take that 1/8 of the budget and to exercise some serious restraint, I mean, that's not nothing, and it's obviously a first step. Now, the big grill in the room obviously is entitlements, and that language is a little ambiguous. They say they want to protect Social Security and other entitlements for today's seniors and for future generations. And one way you can interpret that is they're only going to be there in something like their current form for future generations if you ratchet them back somewhat. But they're not explicit about it in this current political environment, which I think is an understandable political calculation. But what I'm wondering, Tim, and I'm curious what you think about this, maybe the environment is different on entitlements than it's ever been before. One, because we have the big deficits and the debt, which are scaring people. Two, because liberals, without a peep of protest really, have put on the table $500 billion worth of cuts in Medicare. So I'm not sure the form of those cuts is the right form, but that's a pool.
Are you saying that Republicans can't club Democrats about entitlements because Democrats are being too fiscally responsible?
No, hold on. And you'll have this Obama Commission coming out, and it'll obviously be a mix of cuts and tax increases. But the cuts from the Obama Commission will be there and be in play. So I think the combination of all those things may create an environment where Republicans, I don't think they should go crazy on entitlements. It shouldn't be a full Ryan plan. They should try to implement if they win in November. But it may be an environment where they can go a little further on that on those programs than they would in any other context, and not pay the sort of price they did 95, 96 when they took on Medicare, and very briefly in the 80s when the Reagan administration floated ratcheting back Social Security a little bit and then very quickly retreated.
Right. Yeah. So you're, if I understand you, you're saying you believe Republicans ought to be speaking more about entitlement spending in the midterm elections.
No. No.
Oh, I'm sorry, I did misunderstand you.
Politically,
you're saying you are saying the opposite, which is that there's no need because that's actually going to happen because there's bipartisan agreement. So no point in demagoguing that.
Well, no. What I'm saying is I understand why they don't have it in the pledge, but everyone knows you're going to have to take it on in some form or another if we're going to get the budget under control. And what I'm saying, it may be a better environment for doing that than we've had at any other time in our lifetimes. Because of those three factors I outlined.
But wouldn't another way to construe what you're saying is why elect Republicans when Democrats look like they're serious about addressing the entitlement problem?
Oh, well, Democrats aren't serious at all. I mean, you have Nancy Pelosi saying that this pledge, which is extremely mild and the best interpretation on entitlements, is going to end our commitment to our seniors for Social Security. So, I mean, that's just ridiculous, and that's just the typical demagoguery you've had over the last 50 years. And the problem with what Democrats did on Medicare is even if you say those are the best forms of cuts, and healthcare people on our side say they're not, and they'll lead to price controls, and you have the head of CMS saying they'll threaten the existence of various institutions that are dependent on Medicare funding. Even if you say it's the best form of cuts, they take that money and plow it into what else when we already have an entitlement crisis? Yet another new poorly funded entitlement in the form of Obamacare. So I would, if I were a Republican, I'd repeal Obamacare, I'd repeal the tax increases in Obamacare, but I would keep some of those cuts and reallocate them, do them differently, in the hopes that Democrats can't demagogue on that because they already passed those cuts without the AARP or outside liberal groups or anyone complaining that it was going to harm the program. So I just take that
Some might
kitty
say
of money
if the
being
AARP
in play.
didn't complain about it, how terrible could they have been for seniors?
Well, exactly. So if that money is in play, let's use it. And if you repeal Obamacare and all that spending, and then have those cuts on the table, well, then that's a step towards restraining entitlements.
Now, let's talk. A big piece of the pledge is repeal Obamacare, and which I actually don't believe to be a political winner. Obviously, the Republican leadership does. Do you think it's a political winner?
I do, and I think even if we probably discussed this the last time we chatted, I was referring to earlier, even if you say the chances of repeal are extremely rare, extremely long, say a 1% chance, I would still think that everything that's happened since its passage has served to make those odds better rather than worse. And I don't think they're 1%. I think they're much better than that. But just for the sake of argument, I mean, it's been persistently unpopular. It has not ticked up in popularity the way Democrats were hoping after its passage. You have Democrats running from it in droves, and basically the only Democrats who are talking about Obamacare are those who voted against it to try to get some insulation from what seems to be a building anti-democratic wave. You've had various nasty surprises about what is actually in the bill, and you've had a Republican Party that is almost totally united in calling for its repeal and committed to doing that if they get the majority. So the legitimacy of this legislation is still very much in doubt and very much in play.
Well, what's happening as of this week is some of the really key provisions in Obamacare are taking effect. Really, for the first time, really significant provisions that will affect a great number of families. The best known of which is that children insurers now must take children with pre-existing conditions. Something they weren't required to do before. Also, a ban has gone into effect on what is, without question, the most appalling practice of health insurers, which is rescission, whereby if you come down with a serious illness, your insurer immediately begins the hunt for some minor clerical error in your paperwork to justify denying you benefits. Both of those things are, as of this week, are no longer the law of the land. Now, surely, Republican voters, when they, or rather independent voters, which is really who we're talking about, will favor these things, no? Well,
I don't know. We also see that the insurers are just getting out of, some of them dropping those sort of policies, getting out of the business of covering children and at all, right? I mean,
child-only policies,
right?
Yeah.
So I mean, you're seeing that what is an entirely predictable effect, that you can mandate these benefits, but they cost something. They're not free, and insurers just are not going to absorb the cost. They're either going to pass it on to consumers, or they're going to get out of that business and move on to something else. And
insurers, they're a little greedy. They want the $500 billion in government benefits that they're going to get out of this deal, but they don't want the responsibilities associated with taking on sick people.
Well, yeah, sure. They would love government to mandate that people buy their products, which is what this bill does. I'm not sure whether that mandate will actually hold up in the courts, but even
also they are in effect receiving subsidies because subsidies are going to people who are purchasing their insurance policies.
Right, but even if you accept for the sake of argument that this is that the two policies you mentioned have no unintended consequences or unfortunate side adverse effects, the number of people they're actually going to affect is relatively small. And this bill was sold on such false pretenses that it was going to control premium increases and bend the cost curve down, which has now really been abandoned as an argument in its favor because it was so obviously untrue, and it's being proven untrue on the ground every day. That I think
I don't think it's been proven. I don't think it's been proven untrue yet, but I do agree with you that it is untrue. I think the reality the reality always was that the bill would likely pay for itself, but claims that it would do much more than that were always not plausible.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's a big problem. When this is a huge piece of legislation. When a key argument of it that the President of the United States repeated over and over again, a very bright man who should have known better, something is not true about it. That's one of the reasons the thing is in jeopardy. And I mean, there's a reason that big pieces of legislation you build a case for it over years, and you get a bipartisan majority, and then it has the legitimacy to last forever. Or a very long time. And this bill just does not have that kind of standing. Now, it doesn't mean it's going to get repealed. It's going to be hard. It's going to take a Republican president. It's going to take a lot of effort to reverse it. One political effect, though, I think that is interesting. We get into this discussion looking ahead, perhaps prematurely, to a Republican majority. How would Obama react? Would he react like Clinton? Would he triangulate and go to the center? I think Clinton was a much freer man in that regard because he really hadn't done anything. His big healthcare effort failed. Obama, on the other hand, is just tethered to the mast of this huge liberal, big spending piece of legislation, and it's going to be a big element of the political fight with Republicans. So even if he wanted to triangulate, it's going to be difficult for him.
I'm not sure I agree with that, but Clinton had raised taxes considerably to the howls of outrage from Republicans and the promise that it was going to wreck the economy. But in any case, well, let's move on sort of more broadly to the midterm elections. I was just looking over Charlie Cook's latest calculations, and his prediction is that the Republicans will win the House, but not by much, and that they may win the Senate or they may not. How does that jive with your thoughts?
I'm not a House watcher. You really have to have a view of some granularity, kind of seat by seats, which I don't have. Very much a big picture guy on this, but I think the range is probably very close to picking up the majority to 60 seats. I mean, I think it could potentially be an enormous blowout, and I think there's a reason that historically in the 20th century, when the party takes the House, to take the Senate too, is because to take the House, you usually need a wave, and when you get a wave, you get all those marginal seats coming in. So if it's a big enough wave, I would expect Republicans to win in places like West Virginia, Wisconsin, maybe Washington State and California, and take the Senate
Delaware?
As well. Delaware is a heavy lift, my friend.
And where do you stand? I know a lot of conservative Republicans have put some distance between themselves and O'Donnell. Are you in that camp?
Well, yeah, we were skeptics during the primary, and we sort of had our say. And now it's a general election. We'd much rather see her, obviously, than Chris Coons. But she has obviously a lot of ground to make up. She has a lot of resources now, $2 million or whatever. The NRSC, if they had schemed how best to raise money for Christine O'Donnell. They couldn't have done it any better than the way it worked out. And $2 million in Delaware, she had that line in her victory speech. $100 here goes a long way. $2 million per capita in Delaware, that's a heck of a lot of money. So I don't entirely count her out, but I would expect it to be the last seat that comes in. If Republicans somehow get 13 seats, she'll win if the wave is that big.
I was very surprised to learn this week that the governor's race in New York is where you are is much tighter than people expected. Yeah,
that's a shocker. I kind of think, Tim, my view is there's a ceiling of 45%, almost for any Republican across the country. A friend of mine months ago, when talking about the current environment, said, look to Pat Moynihan's race in 1994. I mean, this is a lion of the Senate, running in a pretty liberal state against a candidate, Bernadette Castro, who is not particularly serious, had no money, and really didn't run a campaign to speak of. She got 45% against Pat Moynihan. And that's why you never know. Cuomo, I mean, he should be running a little bit scared, and Kirsten Gillibrand should be running very scared.
I guess we are both kind of siding with the conventional wisdom here, which is
are you
still in trouble in the midterms?
So you're committing yourself to Republicans taking the House?
No. But I do think that they are. I do think it is worrisome. I am still holding out hope that the last-minute negative ads that go flying against the Tea Party candidates will have some effect.
So what would your strategic advice be to Democrats? Just that? Is there anything else they can be doing?
That's all I can think of. I mean, there's some really sweet material for negative ads with some of those Tea Party candidates. And I think Democrats might even start in early on some of them. I think some of them have started in early already. But it's tough. The math is tough. Unemployment is close to 10%, and it's hard for the governing party to do very well in those circumstances. End of story. My gut has all along told me that Republicans have actually done themselves a lot of harm by moving too far to the right. But that is not being reflected in the polls, I will grant you. And so I think the only chance of that manifesting itself will be at the very end. It's certainly not happening now.
Yeah, I mean, this is the key thing, is just independents are more or less where conservatives are on a lot of the most important issues. Certainly the fiscal stuff at the moment, even some of the more peripheral hot-button issues, the mosque here in New York City, the Arizona immigration law. So that's a big problem for the Democrats.
Are people still talking about? I sort of have the sense that the mosque is sort of evaporated as an issue.
It's dropped off. I'm sure it'll be back. It's weird, though. On just Labor Day, it's like someone hit a switch and just everything was election.
Well, I just thought, I actually was predicting during the summer. I said this is a classic
August
summer issue that evaporates after Labor Day, just because it is, because after Labor Day, people actually start concentrating on what's important.
We shall see. I don't expect it to come back, but we'll see.
You do think it'll come back, and certainly Newt Gingrich is counting on its coming back. Well, he's not running in the midterms, but he's pretty heavily invested in that issue for reasons which continue to puzzle me. Do you have any thoughts about that?
I'm not sure whether there's any deep theory, except for that he is offended by it. I do think Newt realizes that looking ahead to 2012, Republican primary politics, there's really not any danger of being too far to the right and being too hard-hitting, kind of a conservative. So I think you've seen that reflected in his rhetoric in a whole host of ways.
Which this is not on our list of topics. So don't feel obliged to answer this, but I am curious. You know, whenever I'm involved in a political discussion with a Republican these days, one thing I'm always really curious about is, you know, who are going to be the leading Republican candidates for president. I'm convinced Romney is a dead man because of Obamacare. He's been scorned by the Club of Rome and the editorial page of the Wall Street Journal for being soft on Obamacare. And if you're positioning yourself as the you know, sort of conservative, economically conservative candidate, surely that's got to be fatal. But you know, on the other hand, maybe people just forget over time. Who do you think are? But then that does raise the question: if not Romney, then who? Who do you think the major players are going to be?
Well, obviously Romney. He's running, and he has the advantage in the Republican primary of having done it before.
Have you guys been mean to him about being soft on Obamacare?
We have, and we've sort of tried to come up with various ways for him to try to explain himself and get out of the box he's in. But I'm not sure there's any way out of it except for saying it's a mistake. And he shouldn't have done it, which he's obviously very reluctant to do.
It's his signature accomplishment in politics.
Yeah,
it's
and
a little awkward to call that a mistake.
Sure, and when you have the reputation of a flip-flopper on other stuff, it would be hard to do anyway, but that even makes it harder. So, but
so he is not beloved at your shop either. Is that accurate?
Well,
to say?
we endorsed him in 2008. Mostly or partly as an anti-McCain thing. But, McCain is not a bad example for Romney because McCain had many, many heresies as well, but ended up being just kind of the most electable, most acceptable to the most people, even though they weren't that excited about him, kind of candidate. And if Romney wins, which I don't discount, that'll be the reason. But there's no doubt that the Massachusetts care is a huge problem. And among conservative elites, I would say most of them agree with you that it very likely could be fatal. But then you get to the question, if not Romney, who else? And maybe there's just no answer to that, and that will be the best argument for Romney. Obviously, Sarah Palin, she's much more viable than I would have thought after she quit in Alaska. I thought that move for her was very shrewd in many ways, but I thought it really kind of ended her career as a viable elected figure and a potential presidential candidate. But she's proven much more resilient than I would have thought. If she gets in, I think she immediately becomes the front runner, but something that we've never seen in Republican politics before, an anti-establishment front runner. But the question is whether she'll be able to address those doubts that even Republicans have about does she have the experience and is she electable. And then you have Mitch Daniels, I like very much. I fear he'll be a little bit of an elite, op-ed writer kind of taste, and not necessarily take off among people.
Mitch Daniels has been described to me, I think perhaps even by you, as sort of the closest thing to a kind of pure Romney replacement. I can't remember. Did you say that in our last conversation?
I don't think I said that. It might be occupying slightly similar territory. The question is, I don't know whether you read the Fantastic as...
No, I'm sorry. I think it was Byron York who said that. I apologize for...
I don't know whether you read the Fantastic, as always, Andy Ferguson piece in the Weekly Standard on Daniels. But I thought...
No, I didn't know it existed. I love Andy Ferguson.
Yeah, you have to go back and look at it. But what I was surprised by is there in Indiana, he does have a common kind of populist touch. He rides a Harley Davidson. He's likes mixing it up with the ordinary folks. There are great anecdotes in that piece of him just randomly at McDonald's sitting down with a couple guys who I think are roofers, or some sort of contractors, and getting on with them famously, which is kind of surprising because in person he is not does not strike you as he's not a backslapper. He does seem very much like a former OMB director. So if somehow if that were to be translated into Iowa, and he would have the fire in the belly to go do everything you need to do on the hustings there, maybe he could take off. But, you know, I think there are going to be a lot of people running. As Gingrich said, it's going to be about a dozen people. And there's going to be someone on the model of Huckabee that none of us have really thought about who just comes out of nowhere and is a major force.
Yeah, but those guys who come out of nowhere never get the nomination. They just get a lot of attention for coming closer than anybody ever thought.
Usually that's
I'm trying to think. Who was the last come out of nowhere nominee? William Jennings Bryan?
Yeah, well, I don't think there's been one in our memory, but if there's ever going to be a time, if the mood is anything like it is now among conservatives, 12 would be the time it happens. But it's amazing. You know, I was looking this up online last night. Don't ask me why. It shows I have no life. But the Iowa straw poll, you know, is less than a year away, and that will winnow the field significantly. So we are, you know, within a year of really significant Republican presidential politics. Amazing enough. Let me ask you this, because I heard it in some green room chatter. Someone making this point the other day, that if Feingold loses, the Obama administration better go out of its way to find him a cabinet slot or something, because the most likely primary challenges to Obama would be someone like a Feingold or a Howard Dean coming at him from the left.
That sounds like I will bet you $50 that comment came from a conservative.
No, it
sounds
didn't.
like wishful thinking.
Oh, it didn't.
Really? I owe you $50. Oh no!
Payable a lunch sometime. We'll make it a lunch.
Okay, I'll take you to a very expensive lunch in New York. Really? You know, it seems pretty improbable. Much as though I am an admirer of Feingold, less so of Dean, but you know, Feingold doesn't seem to me, first of all, a plausible opponent to Obama. Dean seems less so, and I can't really see why either of them would want to. I mean, you know, they certainly remember what happened in 1979 when Teddy Kennedy had this bright idea, and Obama is a heck of a lot more popular than Jimmy Carter was back in 1979. So, no, I have a pretty hard time seeing that happen.
Now, why do you think, as an admirer of Feingold, why do you think he's having such trouble this year? And we've had some fun poking at him, just these excoriating negative ads he's running after, for his entire career, priding himself on being such a positive campaigner and you know, someone who's absolutely not the ordinary politician who's in this race has to resort to the typical tactics just torn from the textbook of what you do when you're desperate.
Did he break down and take PAC money or no?
I don't think so, but I'm not sure. I know he's really sucking wind when it comes to fundraising, apparently.
You know, I haven't followed it at all, so I don't know. But he does seem to be in trouble, which is, you know, surprising. You know, I guess I lacking specific information, I'm inclined to put it under my catch-all theory that it's the economy.
The economy's
you know, the economy's in really bad shape. There is no question about that. So, well, let's move on to our next topic, which is, what was our next topic? Hang on just a second here. Larry Summers.
You probably have more insight into that than I do.
I'm sorry to hear that, because I don't have a lot. You know, obviously he is leaving, and you know he's leaving before anybody can say mission accomplished. I don't think we can say that his tenure there was a failure, at least insofar as he doesn't seem to have a lot of critics. What few critics he has are on the left, not the right. I guess the only criticism you could make of him is that he wasn't left-wing enough. But being more left-wing in that position would have been very difficult politics. You know, you can argue that if the stimulus had been bigger, that that we would be better off economically today than we were. Some people have argued that, but I don't see Summers as the guy who really was the obstacle there. I think that Congress was the obstacle. I don't have strong feelings about Summers one way or the other. He seems to have mellowed a little bit in this position, one hears. Of course, people say that, that's been said many times throughout his career. I have a friend who was a music critic at Newsweek who was writing about a rock star whose name shall go unmentioned, and this rock star said in the interview, well, I think I really kicked the heroin habit now. And all of his friends were saying, yeah, it's great to see this guy's finally, he's gone clean, and that's really great. And then he went back and looked at the clips, and this had come up in every previous interview with him. And there's a bit of that with Summers, too. Not with regard to heroin, but with regard to his habit of being somewhat brusque and egotistical. I'm afraid I'm not shedding very much light on this, but I think it's plausible that he does want to hang on to his professorship at Harvard. Harvard really does have limits on how long a leave you can take, as do most universities, and it's a pretty swell job being an economics professor at Harvard. Arguably a better job than the one he had at Harvard before, which was president of Harvard. So I'm not inclined to disbelieve him when, and as many people have pointed out, 2 years is not an unusual commitment for people in government. There it is. I guess I would. What I'm essentially saying is I don't think that Summers leaving is a matter of enormous significance, except for the fact that we can regretfully observe that he did not bring unemployment back up.
Yeah, it's a little strange to me. You'd think Harvard could make an exception for a former president who's serving the great liberal hope, in the midst of an economic crisis, but maybe they can't. And 2 years is, I assume, it's kind of a burnout position, and 2 years is a fairly long time. I think all these guys, though, are leaving in the midst of a failure. The stimulus to me just seems a blatant failure, and the idea that more spending would have fixed it, I think, is kind of ridiculous. What we know is, I think what we've learned is Keynesian is way too simplistic. You have the whole and aggregate demand, and then you plug it with government spending, and everything's fine. Well, it turns out you can spend a lot of money, and it still doesn't affect the things that are really most important and most needful, which is having businesses hire again, having banks lend, and it's not going to stop people from needing to deleverage if they had too much debt. So we could have. I've seen, remember Wurzag saying that the hole in demand was $2 trillion. Let's be generous and say there's a multiplier of 1. So we've had a $2 trillion stimulus just in 1 year. And, after 1 year, all those three factors I'm describing as most important, they would have been probably exactly the same as they are now, which means you would have had to have another $2 trillion stimulus, and then another, and then another, and then another, until the private economy actually got going again. I think Summers and Romer and all the rest of them, they just fell into a terrible trap, and they wasted tons and tons of money.
Well, that theory doesn't take into account the argument that the money that was spent prevented us from a much more catastrophic recession or depression.
Well, the recession was over before the money got spent.
The official recession was over, but obviously we were in a bad way, and the expectation that the money would get spent probably had some impact. I know a number of economists have Sir Alan Blinder of Princeton among them have written that the downturn would have been significantly worse otherwise.
But the downturn ended. I mean,
you don't buy that at all.
Well, it's voodoo economics. I mean, it's totally faith-based to say we know from the data that the recession was technically over before the money really began to be spent, and then to say it prevented a depression when the economy was already out of the recession is just fanciful.
Well, I am not an economist. It does seem reasonable to me that that the knowledge that money was in the pipeline would have had some impact on behavior. In the same way that I suspect you would argue that the knowledge that a tax cut is in the pipeline would have some impact on behavior. Expectations do matter to some extent.
But I mean, I don't see why a lot of deficit.
And besides, yes, we've sort of technically been out of recession since June 2009. But this is a weird kind of recovery where unemployment has continued to go down during the recovery.
Yeah, well, I mean, marginal tax rates do affect behavior, and the prospect of them going up or down will affect behavior to some extent beforehand.
But the prospect of spending won't.
Yeah, why if you're a business that's going to hire, why would you suddenly say I'm going to hire because the government in Washington is going to be involved in a massive deficit spending program? Why would that affect your behavior in a positive way, and why would you even know it's going to work? I mean, the idea that the recession ended,
you might be a beneficiary of some of that spending directly. You might see ways in which you're a beneficiary indirectly. I mean, it seems to me perfectly analogous with a tax cut.
Well, I mean, most people think it hasn't made any difference. I mean, in the polls. So the idea that this would have affected the business environment such that the recession would have ended in June '09 is just, again, it doesn't make any sense to me. I just think no one can really point to how this program has in any fundamental way helped the problem. It just shot, $800 billion out the door, and it made no or little difference. And unfortunately, Larry Summers and Christina Romer and Orszag will have this legacy around their necks the rest of their careers.
Does National Review have any views about why it should be that we are experiencing a recovery in which unemployment is continuing to go down?
Well, I think there are a couple things. One, if you look at the Rogoff work, he says that recessions that are caused by financial crises are extremely painful. Their effects are extremely long-lasting, and it takes a while to get out of them. And I think if Obama had really been committed to talking to the American public as adults, as he said in the campaign, he would have said that from the beginning, and he wouldn't have bought into a program that was sold on the basis of the recovery being a turnkey operation dependent on spending from Washington. It was just extremely foolish. And I mean, this to me was really the original sin of the Obama administration. It's what got him on the wrong side of the public. It's what made the economy basically his to own, which has slowly been happening over time, and it's what's created this huge reaction against what he's doing. I mean, it's true that if the unemployment rate were 5% rather than above 9%, that our politics would look a lot different. But it's also true that if he didn't embrace this huge, big spending program, that the reaction wouldn't have been so strong against him. And it's just, this, Tim, goes to a lesson about human nature and all of life. Just hubris is such a problem, and we're all prone to it. Newt Gingrich went in, for it for a big way after he won in '94. Bill Clinton did the same thing after '92, and Obama and the Democrats fell for it in an enormous way after '08. And what I'm hoping...
And the hubris was specifically, the demonstration of hubris was healthcare reform?
They thought that they had a mandate from heaven to do whatever they had ever dreamed of doing. And they set about doing it whether it connected with what the public wanted or not, whether it really jibed with the kind of moderate tone Obama had set in his campaign in '08. They just thought that American politics had swung their way in a fundamental way, like 1932, and it was Katie bar the door. and that just wasn't true. People had given them a chance because they're sick of Republicans for understandable reasons, and because the election was held in the midst of a financial crisis with an incumbent Republican president. And this is something that irks me a little bit. You have so many liberals saying, oh, look, Obama's hurt because the economy, so we really should discount the idea that anything he's doing is actually unpopular because it's all economic conditions. Well, let's remember, he got elected and Democrats got those huge numbers in Congress partly because of economic conditions. And if there had actually been an awareness of that, there might have been some caution and some humility. And instead, we got the opposite.
Well, that's one way to look at it. The other way to look at it is that Obama had some significant achievements. He's already achieved more legislatively than Bill Clinton did in 8 years, and that significant achievements will inevitably produce blowback, especially if economic conditions are favorable for the other party to gain power. So. I guess that would be my interpretation. But I'm looking at my watch. We have been going for an hour.
You like George Bush in that famous debate with Bill Clinton? Remember when George H.W. Bush looked at his watch in the Clinton-Perot debate? It was a famous moment because symbolizing his disengagement. And
oh, that's right.
I hope you haven't been.
My looking at my watch symbolized the fact that I have a lunch date at 12:30. The other great watch moment in politics that helped put Mario Cuomo in the governorship was when he made fun of the expensive watch that his opponent had in one of the gubernatorial debates back in the early 80s.
I was not aware of that.
What's his name? Lou.
Lou Lehrman.
Lou Lehrman, yes.
I love Lou Lehrman. He's a great man.
Lou Lehrman made the mistake of wearing an expensive watch to the debate. And Cuomo called him on.
Well, I hope your watch is appropriately down market and popular.
It is. I want to show it's a relatively cheap Swiss Army watch. I'm showing it to the audience here, and I have worn cheaper. I have worn drugstore watches, but this one certainly nobody would mug me over this watch. So anyway. On that light note, it was great to talk to you again, Rich, and let's do it again sometime.
Take care.
Okay, bye.